very warm welcome from Partners for Law in Development to its series, Ways of Seeing and Being on Archiving Feminist Practices. In continuation of the 6-part series dedicated to artists, writers, and filmmakers, the current series will focus on feminist visions of law and justice to curate conversations with practitioners who worked with law as a tool in movement building, collectivization processes using participatory methodologies to forge women's rights agendas from the local to the global levels. These visions and praxis grew through national, regional, and global solidarities that defined feminist movement building during the UN conferences on women, human rights, and similar policy spaces through the 1980s to the 1990s. These series of conversations with feminist practitioners and pioneers at the local, regional, and global levels explores the meanings of collaborative engagement with the law to provide a context and a history to our contemporary alternative praxis on feminist law and justice. Given PLD's location, the curation comprises of practitioners whose work has inspired and shaped work in India and South Asia. This first episode in the series features our guest, Margaret Schuler, who is in conversation with Florence Butegwa. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the two of them. Margaret Schuler, popularly called Marge, is founder and president of Women Law and Development, WLD, whose efforts at movement building before and during the World Conference on Women in Nairobi in 1985 catalyzed the formation of feminist networks across 3 continents, the WILDAF in Africa, CLADEM in Latin America, and APWLD in the Asia Pacific, whose wide cross-sectoral membership base are as vibrant today as they were when founded. A warm welcome to you, Marge. Florence Butegwa is a Pan-African feminist and fellow traveler of Marge Schuler. She was the first regional coordinator of Women in Law and Development in Africa, WILDAF, and the board chairperson of the Women Law and Development International, WLDI. She taught law in Uganda and, amongst other positions, served as the regional advisor to the UN Women African Regional Office and as UN Women representative to the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. A warm welcome to you, Florence. I now invite both Marge and Florence to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madhu. It's a pleasure to be here and definitely a pleasure to speak with Marge, whom I've known for quite some decades, I might say, and who from the work we will be talking about has grown to be a personal friend over those years. So it's really a double pleasure for me. Marge, you are welcome. Could you start by telling us about yourself, who you are, and how you got into the WLD work, the Women Law and Development work?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madhu and Florence. It's a privilege, obviously, for me to be here, and I hope that I will be able to describe the work in a way that reflects what it actually has been. But for myself, I grew up in the northwest part of the United States, and I come from a very large family, actually. I'm one of 12 siblings, and I was one of the oldest. So I often say I raised more kids by the time I was 16 than most people do in their whole life. But anyway, I grew up really with a sense of social justice, a concern for social justice. But there were 2 seminal experiences for me and that led me to Women Law and Development and solidified my commitment to work on women's rights. The first was my time in Chile in the 60s and early 70s, and later was work that I did in Central America in the late 70s and early 80s. So let me tell you about those experiences, because they really defined for me some of the ideas that I tried to put into practice throughout the work. So after college, I went to Chile. And that's where I have to tell you, I became radicalized in a way. I began to see things that had never occurred to me before. And one of those major influences was soon after I arrived, I had the privilege of meeting the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, who happened to be living in Chile at that time because he was in exile from Brazil. So over the next couple of years, I really became his student. And he introduced me to two powerful concepts. And the first was the idea of praxis. I love that word. Reflection and action directed toward the transformation of society or of some institution. So the idea, the relationship, reflection and action, analysis and strategy. So then the other concept really is a belief that he had, to put it in his words, people have the ontological vocation of being creative. And that kind of comes to, it complements the other, because you really have to believe in people and in the process. So I took those concepts with me in my work in the squatter camp. Now, these squatter camps were when people took over land and then tried to negotiate with the government for housing. But in the meantime, while they lived in the camps before housing, which obviously took years, conditions were very difficult, especially for women. And so most of them had children and also needed to work. In the winter rains just caused tremendous misery and mud and illness. And so I worked with the women in one of these camps where I lived to set up a daycare centers. I mean, we worked on community organizing on several different fronts. So that was my first attempt at putting these ideas into practice. But then in 1970, with the election of Salvador Allende, who was a socialist, elected president, the political situation really changed dramatically in the country, because the right wing simply would not tolerate it, did not believe that a socialist could actually be elected president. And they were determined to destroy any effort, any kind of programs or effort that the government, the Popular Unity Coalition, that it tried to implement. So this violence culminated in 1973 with the military coup. And at that point, I knew I had to leave. And I ended up in Washington, D.C. with friends and others who were in exile then from Chile. And I have to tell you, that was a very difficult time for me. I really experienced culture shock coming back to the States after those years. And then, but by the time I finally got my bearings, then I decided to go back to school. And this time I really wanted to focus on this idea of adult learning, engagement of the community, non-formal education, and organization development. How organize people to transform the issues that confront them in society. So that was my experience in Chile. And after I finished, then I got my graduate degrees. Then I was hired by an organization to work in Central America, 3 countries, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. And it was a program to provide legal services for women. And my task was to set it up and facilitate it. So the first thing I did was to ask each of the groups in each of the countries to not just plan on opening their doors to a legal services center, but to really do an analysis of what were the real issues and what could be done about them. And so I introduced a framework for analysis that looked at the law in terms of three components. The substantive component, that would be the content of the law, the formulation of laws and policies that are skewed to the benefit of some and the detriment of others. Then to look at the structural component of the legal system, which would be the courts and the administrative agencies of the state, and to look at how they actually administer the law, and is it to the benefit of some and the burden of others, especially women. And then finally, to look at the culture of the law, how attitudes and behaviors toward the law can also affect women. So using this little framework, they spent about 6 months doing this. And then they started looking at strategies. What could be done? So if the problem is in the substance of the law, then obviously you need to do something to change the law. So once they did the analysis, it became very clear what they needed to do. And so in each country, it was different, because that's another important context. An important issue was the different context. Honduras they were still under a military rule. Nicaragua had just overthrown the 40-year dictatorship of the Somozas. And Costa Rica had a stable liberal democracy with fairly decent laws. So Honduras, they felt that they needed to work on reforming the family code, as did Nicaragua, because they were in the process of building something entirely new. So out of that experience, working with that over a couple of years, it showed, there were a number of learnings that came out of it, that the political and legal context really shape how people see the problem and what can be done about it. And then as participants try to expand or understand the legal status of women, they gain a better understanding of gender inequalities, the source of gender inequalities and disparities. And finally, another learning was that process of dialogue, because not only did the groups work in each country, but we came together so they could learn from one another across countries, that was a very powerful source of learning and for producing action strategies. So those were the two areas that really influenced my thinking going forward toward women law development.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is very interesting. So then, briefly, how would you describe or define or explain somebody, what is this women law and development to you? Because as you moved into the other regions, that was a framework you were working with, but what is it?
Okay, well, to begin with, I would say women law and development grew out of a vision that law could be used in a strategic way as a tool for women's empowerment. That's the first thing, major concept. It also evolved as a dialogue between law and the social sciences, between academics and activists. And it was very important in the work that we did that we included all of those, okay? And then it also emerged as the result of a dynamic exchange of ideas and insights among women in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And this is why I think of women law and development in a way as a concept, as an approach, and an organization. So as an approach, it just means that there's a methodology embedded in the work involving critical analysis of the law, cross-cultural sharing of ideas and strategies, and participatory action research that engages the participants in the whole process. So that's what I mean by an approach. And then as an organization, well, it has had several expressions, organizational expressions at national, regional, and international levels. So that's how that's how I describe women law and development.
Oh, thank you. I would like to go back to that last bit, the expression as organizations. Do you mean those organizations that applied that approach then could be seen as women law and development, as part of women law and development on a continuum, national, regional, and international? Would that describe, or would that be a correct interpretation?
Yes, I think so. But I also think other organizations perhaps use the methodology as well. But I think it's, when I was talking about women law and development emerging, I was thinking of the regional organizations that we developed, and then later the Women Law and Development International, which we'll talk about both of these things later. But I mean, I also came across, and I never met them at all, I came across some women who called their local organization Women Law and Development. And we weren't even connected, but somehow something inspired them to figure out how to use the law as a tool for women's empowerment. And they liked that idea and named their organization that. So
yeah, probably there are many, many more. Whether known to us or not, they may have been inspired by that approach, by the work we were doing, or it may be a natural progression in their local context, realizing that indeed law is important. So Marge, how did you move from Chile and Central America to go to Asia, to Africa?
Okay. One of the things that came out of Central America also was, for me, a realization there's really a lack of a knowledge base that could have provided some kind of programmatic or theoretical guidance to the women, because we really didn't know what was going on in other places, and we didn't have anything to learn from. But so I got the idea, because I was thinking, we knew that this is 1984, we knew that the World Conference on Women was going to take place in Nairobi in 1985, and that there would be an NGO forum that would be substantive, much bigger than any time before NGOs had come together. So I thought, let us use that occasion to make the connections, to discover what's happening, and to facilitate the process of dialogue that across regions that we had thought about. So I wrote a proposal, and I was able to get some funds to fund my outreach. So I spent about 3 months in each region, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And I visited 5 to 6 countries, spending a couple of weeks in each place, trying to identify, make connections. And it was just amazing, because sometimes I only had like a telephone number when I arrived in a particular country, but then one contact led to another, and I ended up with absolutely a treasure trove of ideas and understandings of what people were doing. But one of the challenges that I found was that they didn't always use the same language, and because they were coming from maybe different ideological frameworks. So I again tried to find a way to bridge that gap and to provide a framework for people to actually do that analysis of their own work and encourage them to make that a collective process in their own groups, and not just have one person write it. So I, after those three, I had identified 50 or 60 different organizations. So then I invited 2 people from each region to come together and design the forum that we would do in Nairobi. And they came up with the goals, the participants. They identified more participants than I had, obviously, because I didn't go everywhere, and the themes. So the law, the state, law, and women was one major theme. Custom, ethnicity, religion, that was another theme as it affects women. And then finally, violence and exploitation. That covered such issues as rape and domestic violence, but also exploitation of women in the workforce. So that was the other theme. So in the interim, after we did all the planning, of course, it's always an issue. We have to raise funds, and the other challenge that we had wasn't just raising the funds; it was communicating, because this was 1984. We didn't even have fax then, so communicating with people. Obviously, we didn't have cell phones and Zoom, so that was a challenge. But about 50 people were able to get there that we worked with, and people came with their papers, and the forum took place at about, I think, 3 or 4 days, and there, as I say, 50 presenters, either in plenary or in workshops. Just another thing I would say, it was really exciting. People were excited to be coming together and hearing and listening to people from other countries and other regions. And there really was a sense of solidarity that came out of that. And then Florence, were you there?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. I was there. I wasn't one of the 50, because at the time I lived in Nairobi, and I had just done this research on legal awareness for women. And just the Third World Forum was the perfect place to go and share those findings I had. But I tell you, the forum was monumental in terms of the excitement, because different women were working on different things in their own local situation. Now, all of a sudden, they were hearing some other group in a different continent were also grappling with the same strategies and how to make it effective. And so there was so much learning, in addition to, I think, building friendships and collaborations. In the corridors, we were talking about how we will follow up with people in Asia, how we will follow up with people in different countries in Africa. So for me, that forum was very, very important. And I want to come to you and say, on reflection, what do you think was the significance of the Third World Forum in 1985 to the work that developed as women, law and development?
Well, Florence, it absolutely, it defined the agenda to the future. Absolutely. The recommendations that came out of that, one of them, first they wanted to make sure that they recommended that regional conferences be organized and regional conferences and networks be organized. That was one of the first. They envisioned some kind of international structures that would be there to raise awareness and protect the violations of women's civil and human rights. And they, the push for the regional, but they also were very clear on keeping the focus on using the law as a tool for empowerment. So I think those three, when I think about it, we did go on to organize the regionally, but one of the things that happened basically at the international level, at the UN level, and we can talk about this later, but it was the naming of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And that was something sort of envisioned at that time, but it took a while, and it took the next UN Conference on Human Rights to kind of solidify it. But the seed was there. And obviously the use of law as a tool for empowerment was a given.
I would like you to share with us that process of translating the recommendations into something real, something tangible, something that would carry the agenda and the vision of the women who were in Nairobi into reality.
Okay, yes. Oh, I remember. I thought, oh gosh, my work is done. They've really done it. It's come together. And then they asked me to the planning team, and we expanded it actually during it wasn't just the six of us. We expanded the team also during the conference itself. And at the end they said, please work with us to get this thing going. So, wow. Okay. So I sat down, I wrote a proposal to organize on all three regions. And I submitted the proposal to the donor that had been the most favorable so far. And they said, no. They said, regional organizations never work. That was what I got. So, that's a message I received. So I called and I said, please, can I please have a meeting with the decision maker in this foundation? So I went and I said, I bet there has not been women organizing at a regional level, and this is different. And so they said, okay, well, we'll just start with one. We'll see how that goes. So at least we got to start. And I will say it was a little bit uneven, the planning. The planning and the organizing and the bringing together was a little bit uneven, partly dependent on funding, but still the process was very similar. We identified people in each country to take some kind of a lead and convene women in their country and do that same beginning analysis and preparation for the conference. So people didn't just come to the conference to attend something, they came prepared, every one of them. And so there were workshops or meetings at the national level in each country. and then finally a regional conference. And this, at which time the women at the conference then formally founded the organization, set their objectives, and elected their officers. So that was that phase of organization. And again, Florence, that's where I met you. I did not meet you in Nairobi because somehow I had missed you. Nobody told me about you, that you had done this wonderful work. No one told me, so I didn't know. But then when we had those regional workshops in Africa, I remember I met Florence in Uganda, in Jinja, and there she was with a baby, a tiny baby, just weeks old, right, Florence? Anyway, it was wonderful. And so that's basically, but it took 4 years to till all 3 organizations were actually up and running. So I don't know if you want to add something to that, Florence.
Yeah, no, perhaps what I could do is share a bit of what happened in Africa, because quite a number of women were at the conference in Nairobi. So the excitement was there. So on return, I remember the Nigerian women were really excited, and they started organizing at the local level. In Uganda, we had women who had been in Nairobi, so they came, reported to those who did not go about what is happening, what happened not only at the conference, but what they had women in Asia were doing, women in Latin America were doing, women in other countries of Africa were doing, and how similar, but also how different in terms of approach. So that was very interesting. Also beginning to think critically, if we wanted to make an impact, what are the priority issues and what are the main strategies we wanted to go forward with. So by the time we went to Zimbabwe, where the regional conference was, a lot of the women had been corresponding across countries, and in each country, they had their mini strategy in terms of what they wanted to get out of the regional conference, so that building the consensus at the regional level was not as difficult, because you remember Africa is such a big continent. Initially, we were worried that how do you bring so many people? It was a big conference, I remember, but really a happy one, a very substantive one. And I think the same thing happened in the other regions. And the objectives of the networks didn't vary so much, because we are working with the same framework of law. So you had a lot of emphasis on building capacities of the organizations that were working with the women, at a lot of focus on creating legal awareness, addressing violence against women, dealing with property rights and economic rights in different formulations across the regions.
Once we had the conference in each region, of course, then came the next steps of what they were going to do. Because in every case, in the meeting in Tagaytay in the Philippines, where APWOD established itself, a meeting in Costa Rica, where CLADM established itself, then finally in Harare, where WILDAF, the participants wanted to start a regional organization for Africa. And it was that point, excuse me, that Florence really came into the picture. And so I would like, if Florence could tell us a little bit about what happened then, because for any one of these organizations to become a real entity, it meant an enormous amount of work. And I think you can really enlighten us about that aspect of the work, Florence. Thanks.
Thank you, Marge. Once the decision was made to start the organization, and with Marge and Lisa's support, it was agreed that for it to start, there really needed to be somebody from the network on the ground. Lisa came over to Zimbabwe. Incidentally, the conference had decided the head office would be in Zimbabwe, in Harare. So I moved to Harare, or I'd rather say we moved with Lisa Venneklassen. We shared an apartment together, and I moved with my youngest 3 children because by then my partner was doing his PhD in the US. So I moved with the family. It was a very interesting time. And I think one of the most interesting bit was the conversation with development partners, trying to find a donor who would agree to invest in something that doesn't even exist. That was really, and it picks up from Marge's experience that she talked about when she was looking for funding for supporting the regional organizing. So a lot of the donors were asking, but you have no track record. Region organizations are difficult to work. And there was this notion that women's organizing should target women directly at the grassroots level. And that was something that I think upset me a lot. Like women must be confined to working on basic needs only, because the argument was that there are so many poor women, you should go out there, help them start some micro projects and so on. And we were saying, no, this is a region organization. And our mandate is to support those organizations that are working directly with the women on the ground. So finally, we did get HIVOS, a Dutch funding organization that is quite progressive, to give us our first grant. The other challenge was, of course, convincing the government in Zimbabwe to register us as an international organization. They are used to international organizations being in the US, in the UK, and then coming to register a branch office, so to be registered, accredited as an international organization. We didn't want to be registered as a national organization. So that also took some convincing to show how an African organization fulfills the qualifications that other organizations had. And in fact, we did more than that because it was an organization of members. So that was also an interesting discourse. We had a steering committee, which was the highest decision-making body, composed of people from 15 countries, which was a challenge because we needed to have a regional balance. So people from Central Africa, Western Africa, Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, and so on, It is very good in terms of democratic practice representation, but also it's challenging in terms of resourcing when you have board meetings, when you have a rather big board. But it worked very well. And I think it was the right decision because we were able to tap into the richness of the initiatives in each of those regions. And interestingly, it turned out each of the region provided leadership on a particular thematic area. For instance, in Eastern Africa, where there were lots of conflicts in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Northern Uganda, the East Africans led on the thematic area of women, peace, and security. Southern Africa led us in terms of work on violence against women and property rights. Western Africa led us in terms of structural adjustment and economic rights and so on. So it was a very wonderful way of organizing ourselves. As a network, legal rights awareness was a priority. We wanted to have a mechanism for rapid response in case women's rights advocates. We didn't know about human rights defenders then, but even then there were governments that were very tough on anybody talking rights. So we wanted a rapid response mechanism to support those who might come in conflict with the law or those who might be persecuted. But the bulk of our work was capacity development, developing the tools like the training manuals and so on, so that the organizations could get on with the work of implementation, rather than each organization developing its own training manual and so on. They could adapt that, but we would have the basics drawn from all the good practices in the region. And we developed a core team of trainers who could be called upon to go to Nigeria, to go to Senegal, to go to wherever, Mozambique, and do the training using those materials we developed. And I think the other area we wanted to stop the isolation. The issues that Africa was dealing with were very similar to the issues in Asia, in Latin America. So it was a conscious decision that we would, as much as possible, work with the other networks. And one of the things I learned was that although, for instance, women in India were dealing with the issues around bridal burning, around whatever, we had a corresponding violation in Africa, although we didn't call it that, or it didn't manifest like that, but the underlying issue of discrimination were very similar, very comparable in the different regions. And of course, that collaboration didn't stop within the WLD networks alone. We reached out to other networks, other coalitions, especially in the advocacy at the global level. And within Africa, other networks which were not necessarily part of the women law and development. And I think that approach to building networks and really cementing not cementing, maybe consolidating women's voices on particular issues was very successful. Because if, for instance, there was an issue in Kenya and Kenyan women within the network called on the other networks to support. They could count on people within the WILDAF network, but also women from other networks. And that had a very good outcome in terms of the government responses when issues went out of its national boundaries. Yeah.
So that's great, Florence. Thank you.
Yeah, we could, I think, proceed from your perspective. How did this collaboration work, and what was your role? Because if I recall, one of the decisions in Harare was that WLDI and yourself and Lisa particularly would continue to support the network together with the other networks.
Yes. Well, I think it was at that point that Women Law and Development International became its own thing. And the purpose of it was to support the networks in several areas. It was during the Human Rights Conference in Vienna where we had the first meeting of Women Law and Development International with a board composed of people who had been working in this area and who were there at the conference. So that was the beginning. And it was very clear that our purpose was to support the needs of the networks. And that played itself out in 3 areas: research, clarifying the issues and strategies, and then advocacy, and finally, education and capacity building. And we can talk about each of these areas because each one of them took place in a collaborative manner, but in different ways. So we'll talk about research. The first project really undertaken as WLDI was a research project focusing on 2 themes: violence against women and legal literacy, because those themes had been coming up and that's the feedback we had been receiving from the regions. So we conceived this project again as a participatory research project. We reached out to people working in those areas, working in violence against women and legal literacy, awareness raising. So we brought together a core team of people who would be writing papers for the book. But the reason we had that first meeting, which lasted about a week each, was to lay out all the issues, define the term so everybody was working on the same page, and then divide the work up after people went home. And then the papers came in, and that became Freedom from Violence, Women's Strategies from Around the World. That was one product of this process. But of course, it took about a year. I mean, this was not a quick turnaround, of course. And then the other one, the legal literacy, a tool for women's empowerment. And that was really a wonderful collaborative experience. And Florence was part of it. And I think I don't know if you want to make a comment about it, but that was one of my favorite projects, actually.
Yeah, it was really interesting and important for the collaboration and for the networks, at least for WILDAF, and I believe it was the same for CLADEM and APWLD. It was more than research. It was a time for a core group of people to listen to each other and understand the issues that we were dealing with. It was a time we were almost acting like a think tank, really analyzing, trying to go deeper into what causes this. What do you mean by legal redress? Is it just passing on information about the law? Is it something deeper? How do you do it for it to make sense? So we talked about Paul Freire and his methods of adult literacy. We exchange ideas in terms of those who were using paralegals, those who were using the lawyers. So I think that was one of the most, I think I would, in the end, call it a think tanking exercise and team building. We really became so close because when you know each other so intimately, you've shared everything for 2 weeks, it was easier then to respond to each other in future. Request for information goes through very well. That's what I recall. And of course, the books were extremely useful. They became tools that the networks could use to complement, to understand a bit more what they need to do to be more effective in their strategies at the national level.
So thank you. I just would like to comment that before, when I talked about a methodology being part and parcel of what is women law and development, that was it. In other words, it's not just academic research, it's participatory research that engages people. So it's also network building. It's many things, but the purpose is to clarify the issues and strategies. That was kind of the term we often used. And you asked what was my role. My role obviously was convening, but it was also editing the papers and preparing an overview. So my contribution in the books was the introductory material and actually, this isn't very well known, but I was very computer. I actually laid those books out myself. I did the layout. I did have help editing to make sure we didn't have any mistakes, grammar and so forth, but actually we were able then to just give to the printer camera ready copy. So, I mean, we just did everything. And, but like I say, that was one of my favorite projects. The second area that we worked in with the overall title was advocacy. And that kind of had two parts. One was agenda setting at UN conferences. The Human Rights Conference in '93, we did some work around that. And then the Women's Conference in Beijing. We had our own NGO panels at the conference, but one of the things that came out of the Human Rights Conference was the naming of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And the person who was named to that was Radhika Kumaraswamy, who was critical in the whole conceptualizing and founding of women law and development. And so she asked us to assist in some ways, offer what we had. And so each year we produced a kind of a paper that related to the theme that was going to be, that related to her theme that year. So the first one we did was State Responses to Domestic Violence. And I'm really proud of this little book. It has a wonderful overview, and it includes model legislation. And so that was the research on that was actually done by the staff. We didn't do the same kind of outreach in terms of collaboration. There was a team on our staff who did this. The second one was state responses to rape. And then the third one was gender violence, the hidden war crime. So that was our contribution to helping set the agenda related to women's human rights in that context. The 95 Women's Conference in Beijing, that we spent like a couple of years, and that was a very collaborative process where we worked with other organizations. We tried to identify experts, people with substantive knowledge of different areas, and produced. The outcome was another book called From Basic Needs to Basic Rights. But to produce that book, we had people writing on different themes, and then we came together working very closely with Shanti in Kuala Lumpur. And we had this conference that happened. It was a few months. I think it was toward the end of '94. So the book was out by the time of the conference the following year. And so that pretty much describes the kind of work that we did on the advocacy arena.
What I would like to add is that through that advocacy, the Women Law and Development networks interacted a lot and contributed to more regional and global advocacy towards the world conferences, particularly with the Vienna conference. You will recall that this is the conference where we are pushing to have a recognition of women's rights as human rights. So that wasn't a project just for the WLD networks. So we worked with basically women's rights groups, even if they were in other networks. And we also worked with broad mainstream human rights organizations because we needed them to support the inclusion of women's rights as human rights in the Vienna Declaration. So most of all the three networks had leadership in collaborating, for instance, with the Global Center at Rutgers University, led by Charlotte, to move that agenda forward. And that collaboration was very important because the groups we belonged to were bringing issues and voices from the ground to that international level advocacy. And if you recall, during the Global Tribunal, the International Tribunal in Vienna, most of the case studies were given by people, some of whom belonged to the WLD networks. I was one of those who testified during the tribunal. So that cross-fertilization of ideas and experiences, I think, contributed a lot to the advancement of the notion of women's rights as human rights. That I think a two-way process, because we brought in voices of, let's say, African women to the global level, so that the states were not just listening to international organizations, but to women from across the globe. I think that takes us more smoothly to the internal discussions about how we are going to start crafting, positioning women's rights, the work on women law and development in a human rights framework, and what level of capacity development was needed. And Marge played quite a key role in that area. Would you like to explain?
Yes, of course. One of the things that struck me as there was a great mobilization toward women's rights or human rights related to the 93 conference. And so after that, one of the things that I noticed that people use the phrase a lot, but sometimes I got the feeling, again, I guess this is one of the issues that I always seem to work with. How can we define things that we understand certain words in the same way? And how, so women's rights are human rights. Okay, what do you do with that at a national level or an international level? So we came up with the idea to actually develop a book, a guide, a sort of a handbook. And we did women's human rights step by step. And this also, I think this was a very important project because we had wonderful contributors who wrote, explained in very simple language, what were the main instruments? What were the mechanisms? How did that fit? How could women actually use the UN system through the instruments and mechanisms present to defend their rights? And how could they bring that down to the national level? It was basically to give people more of an international perspective on this. Because one of the things that we learned is that a lot of the lawyers, they didn't know much about international law related to the UN and the various conventions. So first we put this together, and I'm just going to just read the table of contents so you know. Definitions and explanation, international human rights. That was chapter 1. Chapter 2, the UN human rights system. What were the different mechanisms that would relate to women? And then chapter 3, regional systems. So there we could talk about, well, some regions didn't have, Asia didn't have particularly a regional mechanism, but that was explained in there. Chapter 4, national human rights systems. Chapter 5, human rights advocacy. And then how you use those mechanisms. Chapter 6, investigating violations. And here we had Dorothy Thomas, who was at Human Rights Watch at the time, also on our board. She developed that section. And then a step-by-step guide to human rights advocacy, sort of what you do. What is your issue? Where do you go from there? 1, 2, 3. So that's how this came about. And I will say that I've heard from other if this was done only for women, specifically targeted for women, but I've had men tell me that they've used this in training in other organizations that didn't relate to women, because it really has a good overview of how the UN system works. So from that, now we're getting into the whole area of capacity building. So now we have the basis. And the next step was to build a program, a training program, using all the methodologies we could that would encourage learning and that would engage the participants, because just going to a workshop and learning a few things isn't enough. So the idea was we would have these workshops, and then people would go back home and they would have to do certain things before the next time. So this was a whole course that was implemented over a period of a couple of years in each instance. So we did the first one in East Africa with Uganda and Tanzania, Rwanda. I forget the other countries, but that was, I think that was the first iteration. And then we were asked to work, and I haven't mentioned this before, but to work with women in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, because remember, by the early 90s, most of those countries had split out. The Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, and there were all these independent countries. And so there was effort by a number of organizations to assist groups. I mean, there weren't NGOs in those countries before. And so they were just learning. And the thing about understanding human rights, that was another area. So we actually did a program over several years using this methodology and working with, I think we worked with like 20 women from 20 different countries. I mean, from Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, from Poland, that whole region. And that was also fun to get to know so many people. They did not ask to create a regional network per se, because in a way they were just beginning and just learning a number of things. So, I mean, in some countries were more advanced, like Poland, but it was also interesting working with the women. This was after the war in the Balkans. So we had, included in this process were women from Croatia, from my mind is going blank, but you know what I mean. Those countries that have been engaged, the former Yugoslavia, in which they had been engaged in terrible conflict for a long time. So that was very interesting. I remember we had one workshop in Warsaw, and so one day we got on a bus and we drove down to Auschwitz and experienced that in a way that was a big part of learning. It was amazing. So just understanding human rights and violations and what can happen if people are not vigilant. So that was, and then I will just mention this, we received an anonymous grant, we never knew who it came from, to do a training of women sort of on a global level. And the training, we asked our members of our boards to recommend participants. So that's how the participants were selected, through the members of our board. And so there were 3 weeks of training with several months in between. The first was held in Bangladesh. And that was, again, it was just great because we had people coming from South America, from Africa, from Asia, and most had never had the opportunity, wouldn't have had the opportunity to visit a country like Bangladesh and understand Asia in a different way, South Asia in a different way than maybe they did. And then the second week of training took place in Brazil, in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And then the final week took place in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And a wonderful woman from Nigeria, I miss very much because she passed away a couple of years ago, but Obi Nwanko, she pressed me for a very long time to come and do that training in Nigeria. She said, this is really what we need. And at that point, I couldn't raise any money for it, but she found the resources. And so at that point, I said, can we use two of the trainers who just finished the course and let them come and be the trainers? And so Jane Magigita from Tanzania. And then we had Virginia Fikes from Brazil. It was a little difficult, Virginia, because her English was okay, but it was a struggle for her to do the training. Nevertheless, she came and we went through that same process with Obi in Nigeria. So, and it was very interesting because we asked each of them also to write up, to select a strategy, start working on it. And many of them, they set goals like making sure that women were included at all kinds of different levels, because they saw that as a real hindrance for women, the fact that men were making all the decisions. I mean, I'm talking grassroots now, really grassroots. So, but anyway, that was the final sort of course of training that we gave. Unfortunately, because shortly thereafter, Women Law and Development closed, international, I mean, I was unable to follow what happened to the people who had received that training. I don't know if you know, Florence.
Yeah, I know some who participated and they have all done very well. They use that knowledge, they've become excellent trainers, including Jenny Majigita you've talked about. And of course, Obi Nwanko's initiative in Nigeria just took off. Christine here in Uganda has gone on to have to be an excellent trainer in human rights, although her background wasn't human rights. So definitely the trainings were intense, but they were absolutely fantastic in terms of grounding those core trainers in using the human rights framework at the different levels where they worked. But I think one of the most interesting thing is just the fact that the networks continued to exist and to work and to build the capacities and across generations. I think that has got to be a legacy that you must be proud of, and the people you worked with must be proud of. And for many of the people we worked with, we have retained that personal contact even in our retirement. Now you are enjoying a well-deserved retirement period. You must be able to look back and really think, would you share with us what one you see as your couple of most important contribution to women law and development, whether as a process, as an approach, as a concept, in the different iterations it has gone through. What would you say are your two most important contributions?
Well, when I look at it, I think of the contributions of women law and development, and that's different from my own personal. Obviously, it's different from my own personal contribution. But I want to say, and thanks to Florence, who pushed me a couple of years ago to do something with the materials we had. And I put up a website that tells the history better than I'm sure that I've expressed it here. And that also includes all of the materials, all the resources, all the books there for anyone to take. So I think that website is called wld-history.net. And I know we haven't done much outreach about it, but I know people are using it. So hopefully it is a resource that people can use. And the reason that I'm mentioning that is because that exercise really forced me to take a clearer look. Because when Women Law and Development International stopped, because we didn't have continued funding. We had a donor who provided core funding, and then all of a sudden it was for projects. And so it was really hard it was very difficult to continue. We'd also had an evaluation that pointed out that we were at a point where we either had to, because up to that point, it had been a small staff doing a lot of work. The possibilities of growth meant that we needed to specialize. We needed a stable funding source. That was one of the main things. And we didn't have it for a number of reasons. And I must say, I felt so bad, like it was like my fault that we couldn't continue. But later, as I worked through, and by the way, I think one of my contributions is the development of the conceptual frameworks that we've used. And I had a lot of experience that sorting through all the kinds of papers that people have written. And in this course, it really, I was really challenged to look at that. And so in the end, I would say Women Law and Development was part of a global effort to promote women's rights. We were part of that effort, but at one point in time, we played a real key role. And so that, I think, is just a fact. And the other thing, it was the inspiration and the vision of the women in Nairobi that really set the pace. There's no doubt about it. It's sort of like if somebody had given you a handbook and said, okay, this is what you should do. It really came out of that. I mean, it took a lot of creative work on top of that, but when I think about it, what came out of or what the women in Nairobi wanted, there are several things, and I think we can look at each one of them and see how they have been fulfilled and are continuing to be fulfilled. But one was creating this network of women, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And that happened. The second was, well, implementing conferences. I guess that's related to the network. But to promote this exchange of ideas across Asia, Africa, Latin America. Then, formulating draft legislation, that was also one of the things that was recommended. And that happened in many different ways. And one of the other recommendations, popularize the language of the law and promote legal literacy and understanding of the law and human rights, and demystify it so that people feel a sense of participation. Because we all know that so many women, they do not see themselves as subject to rights. And this was the whole idea, to foment understanding and engagement. And then, now it's very interesting, the term that was used in Nairobi is to contribute to a alternative law, which I believe really evolved into a feminist law, because that's basically what they were saying. To develop, I'm going to read what it says, a work toward an alternative law which would maximize women's rights and be drawn from the language, reality, and experiences of the vast majority of third world peoples whose interests historically have been ignored. Well, that's feminist law, it's alternative law. And that's really, I do believe, has been one of the contributions.
Very good, Marge. Thank you so much. We've learned quite a lot, I think, from your sharing. I don't know, over to you, Madhu.
We are hugely grateful to Marge and Florence for coordinating with us across time zones of US West Coast, Uganda, and PLD in India for this conversation. Thank you very much. I'd strongly encourage all of you who are interested to visit the WLD history site for its meticulous record of the processes, concept, photographs, and publications that emerged from the WLD movement. The impact of this movement goes much beyond the institutions that emerged through the process. Indeed, PLD, founded in 1998, much after WLD process, was very much inspired by this movement. On behalf of PLD, I also invite you to check out the repository of the Feminist Law Archives hosted on our website, and join us for the next episodes of this series of curated conversations on feminist visions of law and justice. We'd very much like to hear from you. Give us your feedback on social media and email. Thank you, and catch you at the next episode.